Let me get started. Thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Nick Yi. I'm the co-founder of Quantic Foundry. I'm going to be talking about gaming motivations. Let's say I asked you to come up with a list of key gaming motivations that gamers vary on. In a room full of gamers and game developers, I don't think any of us would have any trouble coming up with our own lists. But all our lists will be a little different. Some of us may have 4 high-level motivations. Others may have dozens of fine-grained motivations. Some of us may propose that socializing and competition are on opposite ends of the same spectrum. Some of us may not even agree what competition means in the first place. So how do we decide? How do we go from there? And how do we measure these motivations in the first place? There's a standardized process in psychology research to answer this very exact question. It revolves around a technique called factor analysis. What it does is it identifies variables that cluster together and those that don't. So imagine if we had a lot of gamers go through a survey on a 5-point Likert scale, how important, on a variety of game motivations, and we got that data back. What the factor analysis does is it surfaces the underlying structure of how those variables actually cluster together or don't. So in this case, the factor, the cluster on the left, that focuses on leveling up quickly, getting as powerful as possible, we may label achievement. The one on the right that focuses on chatting with other people, making friends, we may label as socializing. Factor analysis is kind of like celebrity deathmatch. You throw in a bunch of proposed factors and you can see what model actually comes out. So that's what we did. We went through the academic and industry literature, whether they called it gaming motivations, player taxonomies, models of fun. We extracted the proposed motivations to generate a pilot list of 50 survey items. Items like, how much do you enjoy games with an elaborate storyline? How important is it to you to play a game at the highest level difficulty? We used a bootstrap approach to collect the data and iterate on the model. We started with a panel of 600 gamers to create a good enough model. We took that early data and created an online app. Gamers could come through, take a 5-minute survey, and get a personalized report of their gaming motivations relative to the pool of data that we had. And as the data kept coming in, we would constantly rerun the factor analysis, replace survey items that loaded poorly until a robust model emerged. Here's a sample report that we had. We also made it easy for gamers to share their reports on social media, on Facebook and Twitter and so on. We released the first pilot version of this model in June of 2015 last year. In the first wave, we got 30,000 gamers fill out the profile, and we did a huge revision of the underlying math, the model, and we pushed out the second wave in July. In the second wave, Ars Technica, among other places, picked it up. What the Ars Technica staff did was they actually had a lot of their editors take the profile, and then their write-up was how their profiles compared to each other. On the day of the Ars Technica hit, at its peak, we had over 600 concurrent users going through the profile tool that day. After every big media hit, we have a long tail of social media sharing. In fact, 80% of our respondents come to us via social media, primarily Facebook and then Twitter. To date, we've collected over 220,000 data points worldwide, counted as unique IP addresses. Most of the data comes from North America, the US and Canada, and the EU, but we also have sizable subsamples from Southeast Asia and South America. Let me show you the model that emerged from all this data. We identified 12 unique motivations that grouped into 6 pairs. So in every column, the pairs are highly correlated, and the motivations in different columns are less correlated. Let me go through these fairly briefly. Most of these should feel fairly familiar because they're based on existing taxonomies. Action is the appeal of chaos and mayhem in exciting, fast-paced gameplay. Under social are both competition and socializing, both the social interaction and the teamwork. Mastery is about long-term thinking, whether that's practicing a game over time so you get better at it and you can master the game eventually, or the appeal of strategy. You like to think and plan ahead and make complex decisions based on the information that's available to you. Achievement is different ways of getting points in the game, whether it's completion, getting points just for the sake of more points, collecting everything in the game, or getting points in the sense of leveling up, gaining power, getting better gear, getting powerful swords in the game. Immersion is different ways of becoming embedded within the story of the world, whether that's the sense of immersion, being someone else, somewhere else, or engaging with an elaborate plot with a lot of interesting characters with in-depth backstories. And finally, creativity is different ways of making the game your own, whether that's creating a unique-looking avatar, city, spaceship, or discovery, playing the game in the broadest sense of the word. You're swimming out to the edge of the ocean in World of Warcraft just to see what happens or doesn't happen. I mentioned that the motivations in each column are highly correlated and less so across columns, but those correlations vary, right? Some are a little stronger, some are a little weaker. So ideally what we'd like to be able to do is to visualize that web of relationships across these 12 motivations all at the same time, and we can do that. And when we did that, we found that at the high level, there are actually 3 motivation clusters. There's a technique called multidimensional scaling that does exactly what I just said. So on this map, motivations that are more highly correlated are positioned closer together, and motivations that are less correlated are further apart on the map. I'm starting with the North America data. So on the top blue cluster, we see a lot of the motivations related to long-term thinking. So strategy, challenge, completion, power, things that take place over time. In the left yellow cluster, we have a lot of the storytelling immersion elements, story design, fantasy discovery. On the bottom orange corner, we have a lot of the action social elements, so both community and competition, as well as excitement and destruction. What's interesting is that there are 2 dots that don't clearly fit into their clusters, so discovery and power. They seem to be bridges, right, between the clusters. So discovery is the bridge between the immersion and the strategy, and power is the bridge between the action social and the strategy. This structure is actually consistent for all the geographic regions that we had the data for. I'm going to go through these charts fairly briefly. So it's the same dots in their respective colored clusters. Discovery and power are always on the edges on the bridge. Western Europe, for Eastern Europe, for Southeast Asia, for Australia and New Zealand, and for South America. The pattern is always the same. So I've built upwards in the model. I started with a 12, I ended up with a 3 high level. I'm going to build outwards now and show you how these motivation clusters relate to existing traits in psychology. I'm going to start with the action social cluster, which I think is the most interesting and also unintuitive cluster. And I say unintuitive in the sense that in the literature review that we did, in the taxonomies that we went through, few, if any, of those taxonomies paid any special attention or ascribed any special relationship between the action and social motivations, community, competition, excitement, destruction, that there was something special about all 4 of those together. But that's what we found. In hindsight, we realized that this is something that we could have predicted from personality psychology theory. So in personality psych, the current gold standard for understanding and measuring personality traits is known as the Big 5. It was developed also using factor analysis of thousands of people around the world, decades of research. In pop psychology, everyone thinks they know what extroversion means, right? In pop psychology, extroversion is whether you're outgoing or whether you're quiet. But in personality psych, the research has shown that there's actually a really rich set of traits that cluster around extroversion that we talk about less often. So people who are outgoing, people who are extroverted, also tend to be more cheerful, more optimistic, more excitement and thrill-seeking, and they tend to be more assertive in group situations. That's the full cluster of extroversion. And that's really the underlying glue, right? This is the reason why action social clings together. It's kind of like an expression of personality in the gaming context. The other two connections are a little more straightforward. So conscientiousness is the personality trait for how organized and self-disciplined you are. It maps to the long-term thinking motivations, long-term oriented motivations. Openness is how imaginative, how curious, how unorthodox you are. And that maps to the immersion creativity cluster. When I say map, when I say the motivations map to personality, I don't mean just based on sheer intuition. We actually have the data for that. So alongside the gamer motivation profile, we also provided an optional Big Five profile tool for the gamers coming through. And we had data from the people who completed both. So here's what that data looks like. From the action social cluster, extroversion correlates positively with 3 of them. For openness on the right-hand side, openness correlates positively with all 4 of the motivations in the immersion discovery cluster. The strategy achievement cluster was actually had the weakest correlations. We only found consciousness correlating highly with strategy. So this means that, for example, that people who score high on extroversion also score high on action social. People who are extroverted are the same people who like excitement and fast-paced gameplay. They like competition. They like social interaction in gaming. You'll notice for those of you who are familiar with stats, these correlations are fairly low, which is interesting, I think, actually, that the Big Five is a universal framework, but as you drill into specific contexts, it can lose specificity and it fails to catch the nuances. You kind of need this middle layer to catch all the nuances of specific contexts, like gameplay. But it's still enough of a relationship to show the overall connection as you drill down from the universal layer to the context-specific layer. In the media, well, and in the game community in general, one typical framing of gaming is that games are escapists, that people play games to pretend to be something that they're not. But if you buy the data that I'm showing you, really the opposite is true. Games are kind of like an identity management tool. People play games that align with their core personality traits. So instead of enabling us to pretend to be something that we're not, games actually help us to become more of who we really are. Let me slice the data now demographically. I'll start with gender. When we started drilling into the data, at first, gender differences seem to align with gender stereotypes. So in our data, everyone gets 12 scores, and we can take their highest score and say, this is your primary motivation. So here's what it looks like at the high level. I'm going to slice it by gender, where it gets really interesting. So at the high level, split by gender, the women are the blue bars. For women, the most common primary motivations are fantasy, design, and completion. For the men, it's destruction, competition, strategy, and challenge. You know, again, at a high level, it seems like it's all conforming to gender stereotypes. But then we dug a little deeper and we threw age into the mix. And then we found that a lot of these gender differences are actually dwarfed by age differences. Here's what I mean. Here's a chart of competition. So we're drilling down just looking at competition. The x-axis is age, so from 15 to 55. Every point is the average of all the people who are that age. The colored dots, green are the women, blue are the men. There are 2 interesting trends in this graph. So one is that there is indeed a big gender gap for young players, but that gap goes away past age 45, there's essentially no difference in the appeal of competition between men and women. The second, I think, what's the more interesting finding is that if you look at that starting gap between the young players, the men and the women, that gender gap, and then you compare that delta with the youngest men, so the leftmost blue dot, and the oldest men, the rightmost blue dot, that in fact, there's a bigger difference between older men and young men than between young men and young women. We can actually quantify the effect size of gender and age. Age actually explains twice the variance that gender does in competition and in a lot of the other motivations. We can also calculate the actual overlap between different groups. So here in competition, one of the places where there's the biggest gender difference, there is still nonetheless an 87% overlap between men and women's interest in competition. In the game industry, we spend a lot of time talking about how men and women are different in terms of gaming motivations, what games for women might look like. But what the data is saying, that the elephant in the room is really age. And instead of worrying so much about what games for men and women would look like, we should worry more about what games for different age groups, what games for people as they grow older look like. Speaking of age, the action social cluster motivations is the most age volatile group. That's the group that varies the most dramatically with age, and it's a little different between the men and the women. So for the men, the entire action social cluster, competition, excitement, challenge, community, they all fall, and they fall the most dramatically with age. For the women, you still see excitement and competition there, but you get the interesting replacement of story. So younger women are a lot more interested in narrative than older women are. I spent some time talking about the findings from the motivation data. I'm going to pivot a little and talk about the many unexpected ways we've been able to play with the data due to its sheer size. We never thought we were going to collect this much data. And we had one question that we added serendipitously to the survey. We asked gamers to tell us their favorite games. And we did this as a way to potentially debug the survey. So if there were any factors we couldn't understand, we could look back at the games to figure it out later on. We were really glad we asked this question. So gamers were asked to list up to 3 of their favorite games. We coded the games in Mechanical Turk in triplicate to create a lookup database between the messy names and the canonical names. And the first thing that came to us was, could we try to build a game recommender engine based on this data? So for every gamer who comes through and we get their gamer profile, we can look up the 1,000 gamers who are most similar to that person's profile in the whole of our data set. Essentially, we find you 1,000 groupies from our data, and we surface the games that were popular and favorites among your groupies to show what you might like based on your motivation profile. We then realized that if we get multiple people coming through, if me and a friend come through and you both take the profile, you both get the recommender, we can do the Venn diagram of game recommenders, that what are games that you like, they like, and you both like in the middle. So here we're going from the motivation profile to game titles, but we realized we could also do it the other way around. So if we pick any of the game titles that we have in our data, we can aggregate the audience that listed that game as a favorite, the core engaged audience, and calculate the average profile for a game. So here's what the profile looks like for EUROPA Universalis, right? So we can calculate the demographic profile, the motivation profile, and also the games that are popular among people who play this game or this franchise or this genre. So we have this not just for EUROPA Universalis, we have it for almost 1,000 games. So then we realized if we could drill down into a genre space, we could visualize the relationship between specific game titles in that genre space. So let's take the strategy space, for example. Here I'll tell you how we did this. We picked StarCraft and Civilization as the starting seeds, and we said, we looked at the data to surface the games that are popular among audiences of those 2 games to get the other games in this list. So some people often ask us, why is Counter-Strike in this list? It's being pulled in by StarCraft. So I'm plotting just the strategy dimension on the x-axis, the excitement dimension on the y-axis. Before you all get pissed off at me, there's a lot of, I'm zooming in on the strategy space, right? So there's empty space to the left of the strategy, and there's empty space on the bottom of excitement. I'm just zoomed in on a strategy space. I'm not saying that there's no strategy at all in League of Legends. One thing, we've done this with a lot of genres. We've kind of played around, and in every space that we've looked at, we've seen these interesting relationships and underlying structures that surface. So here in the strategy space, what's really interesting is that the top right quadrant is essentially empty. And in hindsight, we're like, oh, it's obvious in hindsight what's happening, that if I make a game, EUROPA Universalis, that's incredibly strategically complex. There's a lot of information to process through. I have to give you the time to make those decisions. In fact, I have to let you be able to pause the game. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make those decisions in time, and it becomes incredibly frustrating to play the game. On the other hand, the faster and more fast-paced a game is, the game is more based on reactions. There's strategy, but not the kind of strategy where I'm giving you 30 pieces of information and asking you to make a complex decision. So there's kind of a trade-off, right, between the amount of cognitive resources I can take from you. I can either take them from you via strategic complexity or reaction time, but not both, because it wouldn't be fun. If I push you over that edge, the game stops being fun for the majority of gamers. But, games that are right near that edge or slightly beyond that edge may be really good as esport candidates, right? Because there's that level of challenge that a lot of people can't master, but people get the game, but they know they themselves cannot play well. So I've shown you this. I think all of us also have an intuition that these dots represent an aggregate gamer audience. Some of these games probably have more homogeneous audiences than others. And we realized we could drill down in each of these dots, right? We can drill down into a game title or a subspace, say city building games, and do a cluster analysis to surface the personas, the distinct personas, the coherent personas within a specific space in this gaming map. And we can identify what combinations of motivations tend to come up the most, what demographic profiles, what platform preference profiles surface with those, and also estimate the distribution of those personas within that space. You can download the slides at this link. And that's my talk. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Hi, Nick. Can you tell, do you have a data, how is the relative share of each major cluster? Like how many % of Action Social and others?
Sorry, say that again?
Relative share of each cluster, like Action Social, and how many %? Do you have the data?
We do. So everyone gets scored on each of those 12. We've looked at it in that big chart that I showed you by the 12. I haven't done it by the 3. It's a really good question. Email me. Yeah, I'll tell you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a student working on a thesis project that actually I want to take into account player personality, so I'm just curious. I haven't obviously looked into this yet. Thank you so much for this presentation because this is really informative. I'm wondering how much of your data is available online to look at and reference on projects like that?
No, that's a really good question. So this current data set is proprietary. We've done a lot, Nick Ducheneau and I, we've worked on the gaming psychology space for over 10 years. There are past inventories that I can point you to that I have and other researchers have. So I'm happy to point you to those.
Yeah, I might email you. Thanks.
Yep. Let me take your question.
Hi. I noticed your data starts at age 13. Do you have any data for children below the age of 13?
No. So you get a lot of legal restrictions in terms of surveying children under 13, and we did not survey people who are under the age of 13.
Are you aware of anyone who has conducted such a study?
That is a good question. I am sure there has, but I don't know it off the top of my head. But I remember when there was a point where I was looking at other game scholars, and I know it's been done, but I just don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay.
It just gets really, really tricky. Like I don't have to do IRBs anymore, but those of you who are in academia know how painful it is to IRBs, and there are additional set of IRB regulations that come into play for doing any kind of research on people under the age of 13. That makes it particularly tricky. Yeah, it's a great question, though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nick, this is Randy Engel. You and I've talked before, and I very much appreciate your talk today. I'm wondering what you've done in terms of mapping brain chemicals and neurobiology and all that back to this.
That's a great question, and I think it's one of these big problems that will take a lot of different researchers to come together. My background is not in neuropsych or biochem, so it's not an area of research that we've gotten into. But I think as more researchers do this stuff, I think we'll see some really interesting findings with how with chemical changes over age and how that may or may not align with the age findings that we've seen.
I'll send you some emails.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Super great. So I was one of those people that saw this shared on Facebook, went and took it. So I was a little bit primed, and I kind of knew what was going on here.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of your data do you think has some self-selection bias, and how do you check for that? Or is the data set just large enough that it doesn't matter?
That's a really good question, and I think there are a couple of biases in the data that we are aware of. So I know we skew towards a core gamer demographic, and so that brings along a higher percentage of men and a slightly younger gamer base. But it's harder for us to quantify and understand the potential social media biases of this. In a sense, we were glad that it didn't primarily travel through gaming websites like PC Gamer and so forth, that it was more on the social side. So it was good, but again, it's not clear to us what the other potential confounds may be because of that route. It's a great question. Yeah.
Actually, I was going to ask something similar. I'm curious if you guys are planning to do any studies that aren't self-administered online things that will try to build it from the same profile? Because there's obviously a lot of shakiness with that.
So one of the things that we're working with a lot of our clients is actually targeting their gamers specifically, and really looking and being able to track those motivations in line with how they actually behave in the game, so we can actually see does what they say correlate with what they do, and so we're doing a lot of that stuff with clients. Likely a lot of that data cannot be shared, but it's something that we're actually doing alongside this.
Cool. So is that surveys on the games of specific, like just administered
when the problem in what we're doing is we don't have a good sense of of the true representativeness of it.
Yep.
But if we were working in hand with a game company and we know the actual distribution of retention cohorts or different player segments, we can actually sample representatively and have a much better sense of the sample distribution.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
All right. I was really interested in when you talked about age and how that was a bigger correlation. And you mentioned that younger women were more interested in the narrative than older women were in your study. And I was wondering, is that universal? Like all countries, that was a universal thing? Or was that more Europe, Western?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've sliced the data a lot of ways, but we're going at a moderate pace, but there's some questions like that we haven't been able to drill down into fully. So that's a question that we have not looked at yet.
Okay.
But it's a great question. So we know that in a lot of places where we've drilled down into a specific genre or a specific age group, that things tend to change, a little, but I don't know off the top of my head what it does look like, geographically for that question.
Excellent.
It's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. This is obviously really, really cool stuff. So I know somewhere along the line you kind of said you transitioned, you were in phase 1 and then you had a phase 2. I guess I'm curious, what's phase 3? Where, how much or what ways are you going to expand on this data, and what are you going to apply?
I think that the hardest thing about what we did, a lot of my past research was in virtual worlds and MMOs, so I have a taxonomy of motivations in MMOs. where it captures the nuances of do you prefer casual versus raiding guilds, how much time you spend designing your avatar, where they're really grounded in that genre. The biggest difficulty with coming up with a taxonomy at the most general level is you start losing that nuance. So for us, the phase 3 will be figuring out ways to bring that nuance back in a way that's still manageable in a generalized survey. And we're thinking that there will be additions of questions that are targeted of, if you play this genre, which of these things do you generally prefer when you're playing this genre of games?
That's cool, thank you.
Yeah, we're out of time, but there is a wrap-up room. If you don't know where the wrap-up room is, it's right around the corner. Nick Duchon and I will be there. We'll be happy to chat and answer any of your questions after this. Thank you so much for coming to my talk.